John, thanks for joining us today. What was the purpose of the Global Restructuring Group?
GRG, as you've called it, had really two purposes. One was to help businesses that get into financial difficulty, to see whether they can actually be turned around. And the second, if they couldn't, was to protect the bank's capital.
The internal documents we've seen suggest that GRG was trying to make money from distressed business customers. Would you deny that?
Look, we treat all these allegations very seriously. I can honestly say after 2.5 years of looking at millions of documents, hundreds of thousands of emails, I've seen no evidence that GRG profited or pushed a viable business under.
Okay, well maybe I can show you some of that evidence. Here's an internal document from a GRG internal manual, which describes it as a major contributor to the group's bottom line and talks about enhancing revenue opportunities. I've highlighted the relevant bits.
And as I've said, what I acknowledge is GRG had two purposes. One was to help businesses that were in financial difficulty and see whether they could be turned around. And the second was that they couldn't, and unfortunately many businesses that get into financial difficulty can't be saved, was then protect the bank's capital.
Okay.
But I've seen no evidence after 2.5 years of 3 separate reviews. I've seen no evidence that GRG inappropriately targeted customers for making a profit or tried to drive them under if they were a viable business. It just wasn't the evidence I've seen.
You've seen no evidence that they, for example, provoked a default from a customer?
No, I've seen no evidence after 2.5 years of all the documents we've looked at, all the files we've looked at, that GRG artificially put a business into a position where it had to be transferred to GRG.
Okay,
all businesses that were transferred to GRG were in financial difficulty.
Well, that's contradicted somewhat by an email that I've got here. I wonder if you'd be good enough to look at it, because it might enlighten you as to your own bank's practices. It refers to, if necessary, we could provoke a default event. I've highlighted it there for you. And this is in relation to a GRG customer. Provoke a default event. Doesn't that suggest that GRG was engineering defaults?
No, look, I've spent 2.5 years looking at all the cases in terms of GRG.
You don't seem to want to look at this.
And I know what your document says.
You've seen the email talking about provoking a default.
But I'm really clear.
Doesn't that bother you?
I'm really clear, if you let me finish my answer. I'm really clear in all the evidence I've seen over 2.5 years, looking at millions of documents, there was no artificial distressing of businesses to put them to GRG. All businesses that were transferred to GRG were in genuine financial difficulty. You simply cannot engineer a default. A customer has contractual liabilities to the bank. They're either in default or not in default.
Okay, you say that all businesses transferred into GRG were in genuine financial difficulty. But can I refer you to this document? This is a Watch Committee memo, which is a Watch Committee on one of the members of it. The Watch Committee memo here, one of the members of it was Derek Sach, the head of GRG. This describes the triggers for going into GRG, and it makes it very clear that you don't have to be in financial distress to go into GRG. For example, you have a mandatory transfer if the customer just litigates against the bank. Now, you know a lot of customers were litigating because they've been missold interest rate hedging products, or simply because they wanted to get out, breakdown of customer relationship, or any proposed exit strategy. That's your own internal document.
Sure, and I'm very familiar with that. And as I've said,
but then how can you say they have to be in distress, because this shows that they don't?
As I've said, all the evidence I've seen of all the cases that were transferred to GRG, from the 3 reviews we've done over 2.5 years, I've not seen one case where the evidence points to the fact they were artificially distressed to transfer into GRG. It simply isn't true.
But they could be put in there without being distressed, couldn't they? Just because of a breakdown in relationship with the bank?
No, there are a whole range of factors that point to financial distress. What I can say is the evidence I've seen of 2.5 years of looking at countless reviews is that all the businesses that were transferred to GRG were in genuine financial distress.
Really, all of them? Okay, so none put in there just because they were litigating?
No.
Even though that's in your internal manual?
I can only repeat what I've said. There were no cases that I've seen from all the evidence that I've looked at after 2.5 years that showed any of those businesses were artificially transferred into GRG. It simply was not GRG's purpose to target customers that were viable.
It wasn't GRG's purpose to target customers that were viable. Let me refer you to a case here. This is, again, your own internal document, where it suggests there's a clash of interest between GRG and its customers. Rather than getting the maximum return for the customer, they've done a full cash sweep with no funds returned to the customer, and that's written down as a badge of success. you want to have a look at that one?
As I said, I'm not a question of looking. I've seen all your evidence you put on your website. I've seen thousands of pieces of evidence over the last 2.5 years. Literally millions of documents relating to those cases of customers in GRG.
A full cash sweep with no funds returned to the customer. How can that be in the customer's interest?
And I'm saying to you very, very clearly, after 2.5 years, 3 reviews, exhaustive reviews, looking at thousands and thousands of documents, millions of documents, hundreds of thousands of emails, I've seen no evidence of GRG artificially targeting customers to transfer. Customers, unfortunately, were in financial distress. This was, let's just remind ourselves, this was probably the worst financial crisis in living memory. And unfortunately, lots of customers got into financial difficulties. And banks, unfortunately, can't save every customer, as hard as we try, that get into financial difficulty.
You're sounding like the bank is very well intentioned and that it's not bothered about its own profit motive, it's got the customer's interests paramount. But these internal documents suggest that the primary goal of GRG wasn't to help customers in distress, but was to try to release the bank from its obligations in terms of reserving capital. And this internal document from you shows £8 billion of capital was released because of the activities of GRG. That was the real purpose of it, wasn't it?
No, as I've said, GRG had 2 primary purposes. One was to help customers who got into financial difficulties to see whether those businesses could be turned around. If they can't, then the objectives of GRG are to then safeguard the bank's position, its shareholders' capital, and recover money. And the sad fact is, in the global financial crisis, thousands and thousands of businesses, unfortunately, got into financial difficulty.
Or maybe they were put into financial difficulty, Mr. Pain, because of down valuations that were used to put them in breach of their loan-to-value covenants, and then GRG could make more money from customers when they were in its turnaround division, couldn't they?
Look, I can simply say, after 2.5 years of looking at all of the evidence that I've looked at.
You seem to be ignoring my questions and repeating your answer.
I'm not ignoring your questions. I'm trying to answer your questions.
I'm talking about freeing up capital. This is an internal document.
As I've already said, there are 2 purposes for GRG helping a business in restructuring. One of those is to turn viable businesses around. If they can't, then it has to protect the bank's capital. But I've seen no evidence at all, after 2.5 years, millions of documents that point to GRG artificially distressing viable business.
Well, let me show you another document.
Simply isn't true.
Let me show you another of your own internal documents that you probably won't want to look at, because it's from GRG's finance director saying that the purpose of GRG is not turning around struggling businesses, but debt recoverability. Do you want to have a look at that one?
Yeah, I'm familiar with that. I'm familiar with that document as well.
So that doesn't appear to clash with what you're saying, that the finance director says its purpose is recovering debts, and you're saying its purpose is to help businesses.
I'm saying it has both those purposes. It clearly has to help businesses that can be saved to turn them around in the teeth of the financial crisis. But unfortunately, not all businesses can be saved. If that's the case, then the bank has to focus on recovering its own capital and the shareholders' funds invested. Could I remind you, over that period of time, the bank lost literally billions of pounds in its lending to businesses. That was the hard reality truth of the financial crisis. And unfortunately, as painful as it is for our customers, the bank, not all those businesses could be saved.
Do you think that the Royal Bank of Scotland should observe the same proprieties when it's looking to purchase assets from its customers that an insolvency practitioner would, Mr. Pain?
Look, I've looked at all the evidence.
No, I'm asking a question. Do you think that RBS should observe the same proprieties as an insolvency practitioner would when dealing with distressed customers?
We're operating from the position of a bank lending to those customers. And I'm very clear, after all the evidence I've looked at, I've never seen any evidence that points to West Register or RBS acquiring a property below market value or acquiring that property in an inappropriate way.
In order to know that it's market value, you have to market the property, don't you? You would agree?
There are many ways. The acid test...
You can't know if it's market value unless you put the property on the market, correct?
That's one of the alternatives, absolutely.
Then there's another internal document here which says a full marketing process is not required if there's no other lender involved. Now, how can that be maximising the return for the bank and the customer? Perhaps you don't want to look at this one either.
No, it's not a question of not looking at your documents. I'm just trying to answer your question.
So it's right there, a full marketing process is not required. How can that be right?
When West Register, if it was acting on behalf of the bank as a buyer of last resort, it buys any properties it bought on that basis in an open market basis.
No, but Mr. Pain, the question is, forgive me, but how can West Register be a buyer of last resort if it's getting access to bid for its customers' properties and they aren't being put on the open market. It says it right there in black and white.
The process of West Register buying a property was an open market process. There either are other
That
properties.
must be going mad. A full marketing process is not required. It says in GRG's West Register Policy and Procedures Manual.
The only way a property can be acquired by West Register without a full marketing of that sort of property is with the customer's consent. That's a fact.
Doesn't say that here in the manual.
I can only tell you, after 2.5 years, and I've looked at hundreds of cases in terms of involving West Register, it never acquired a property in an inappropriate way. It was simply a buyer of last resort. And one of the important facts we've got to remember is that in this time of the global financial crisis, market values were absolutely plummeting. There weren't buyers for many of these properties. West Register was only used as a buyer of last resort to safeguard the bank's interest rather than put a fire sale up.
Mr. Pain, that's contradicted by your internal documents. You can only have a market value and you can only be a buyer of last resort if you've marketed the property properly. Here it says a full marketing process is not required in your own instruction manual.
I'm making it perfectly clear without repeating everything I've said that West Register never acquired, from all the evidence I've seen after 2.5 years, never acquired a property in an inappropriate way. It was a buyer of last resort if there was a market for those properties. And that was exactly what happened.
Okay, well, never mind the internal information. What about the attitude of GRG staff to customers who are supposed to be in distress? We've spoken to someone, and you will know that there are other cases like this, where they were trying to support a sister-in-law dying of cancer. They were having multiple operations themselves. They asked for GRG to give them a break, and the response within the bank, they've discovered, was no sympathy whatsoever. And to say that the customer, they're appalled that someone would use their sister-in-law's illness to try to make the bank feel bad. Does GRG really have sympathy with its customers and the business customers, or does it not really care about them?
Of course we care about customers. And I'm not saying we didn't make mistakes in the past. We did. Quite frankly, GRG...
Mistakes or a system for making money from businesses artificially put into distress?
I've seen no evidence, after 2.5 years of looking at thousands of cases, that I've seen no evidence of GRG artificially distressing customers. Of course, the tragic circumstances of when a business fails is really tragic for both the customers and for the bank on that basis. I've seen businesses go through the recession. I've helped businesses through the recession in the 90s when I was a banker. It is a very traumatic experience. And I'm not saying we didn't make mistakes. We put our hands up to the mistakes we made.
An unnecessary traumatic experience, the businesses would say.
I've never seen us artificially distress a business just for our own profit. It just didn't happen.
Thank you.
Thank you.